In this lesson, we're going to learn about light properties. Alright, so now that we've learned how to place and manipulate our lights, it's time to learn how to manipulate them or adjust their properties to give us a very specific look in our game. So select this point light, and when you do, you'll notice in the details panel we have things like our transform information as well as our lighting properties. Now there are other properties as well, but we'll be getting into those later on. So the transform properties, pretty basic. This adjusts the rotation, the location, and the scale of your object. Right now we're going to leave it just the way it is. But you'll also notice that we have mobility. This is going to tell us what kind of light this is, and it's really going to adjust how the light is going to behave at render time. Now we'll be talking more about that in the next lesson because I want to take a full lesson and talk specifically about that and how that's going to affect your decisions you make whenever lighting. So let's go into our lighting properties. The light properties, starting out here at the top, are pretty basic. We have our intensity, which in effect you could say that is the power of the light or the brightness of the light. So here, by default, we're set to 5,000. If you were wanting to create something a little bit more of a realistic render, let's say that you were creating an architectural render with inside of an apartment or something like that. A good value to stick around would be around 1700. That is the lumens value of a 100 watt bulb, excuse me. So if you wanted to do something like that. Normally I like to stick around 5,000 and then make my adjustments there based on what I want to create inside of the level. What kind of mood do I want to create? Do I want the player to go down the specific path because it's brighter? Things like that. So lighting can be used very effectively inside of games. So let's talk about light color. Light color is pretty straightforward. You left click on it and you have your color picker. You can choose whatever color you like at this point. Usually we like to stick to colors right here around the middle where they're highly dependent on those white values. Now if it's a light source that is specifically a specific color, so let's say like a red color, let's say that it's an alarm light or something like that, or we have some sort of energy source that is more blue or even purple, okay, you could do that. But in this case, I want to create a mood about this. So I want it to appear to be cold. And so I'm going to affect this with a little bit of a light blue value. And notice how that changes up the overall mood here. So that's a good thing to remember. Now, the brightness of a light is also going to affect the mood of that. So you can adjust your intensity, you can bring that down. Say that I want it to be a little bit darker in these areas, which is pretty good. But then I also have the ability to adjust the attenuation, how far that light reaches out. So the attenuation can be best described or best seen through this blue sphere that you see around the light. It's kind of hard to see here, so let's go ahead and bring it down. I'm going to drag this down, just left click and drag, and you'll see that we get this blue sphere that appears around the light. This is your attenuation radius. So if I drag that up, I'm going to say, all right, I just want to affect these areas right in here. Okay, so that looks pretty good. It's important to adjust your attenuation specifically to the size that you need. You don't want to go too high because that can start to affect your memory. And we'll talk about how that is affected at a later point. So I'm going to set this to around 900. Hit enter, and there we go. Now we also have our source radius and our source length. These really can't be seen unless it's on a reflective surface. Luckily for us, I have this icy surface, and you can see the specular highlight here from that light. The source radius and source length determine the size of the specular highlight on a surface. Okay, so if I adjust my source radius and I start to drag that up, watch as we start to drag this up a little bit higher. Notice how that specular highlight changes. Okay, it appears as though it's getting brighter, but it's really just spreading out. Now you'll also notice that there's this yellow radius that's going around that. Okay, and so again, that affects directly the specular highlight. Now we also have our source length, and if I make my adjustments to that, you'll notice that that specular highlight will begin to lengthen out. Okay, now notice how it fades away. There's only so much light in that. And so that's going to affect the overall power. The larger that radius and that length get, the duller that specular highlight is going to get. All right, so we can adjust that radius. Notice how it begins to brighten up a little bit because it's not taking up quite as much area any longer. And there we go. All right, so now that we have that set, you'll notice that the source length and source radius, let's say that we wanted it to not be this capsule shape in this direction. Let's say that we wanted it to face this direction. We can now rotate that point light, and that will affect that source radius. That is the only reason that we would want to affect or rotate a point light. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set those back to 0, just to leave it as default right there. And there we go. Now we also have a couple of other properties. We have indirect lighting. Usually this is either going to be 0 or it's going to be 1. Do we want global illumination to be enabled? If so, we want it to be set to 1. If we want it to be disabled, we'll set it to 0. We also have the ability to tell a light whether it affects the world or not, so we can turn it on or off. And then we also have cast shadows. So do we want shadows turned on or do we not? In this case, we do. Now, if you left-click on this little arrow here, you'll get more values, but these begin to get a little more complicated and a little more advanced. These have to deal with certain areas of the value set above. We'll be talking about those at a later time. So now that we've talked about those properties, let's take a look at our spotlight. The spotlight is going to have many of the same properties that we've just seen, but there's going to be 2 added ones. The 2 added properties that we see are inner cone angle and outer cone angle. This has to deal with the attenuation of the light, okay? Or excuse me, not the attenuation, but the fall off of the light source. So right now you really can't see much. It doesn't really appear to be affecting our wall, and the reason for that is because you can see the light source is only going so far. It's not hitting this wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my attenuation radius to lengthen that out, and you'll see how that's affecting it. Let's draw the outer cone angle down. I want it to appear like a stream of light pouring through that hole. So there we go. So that's what that's going to look like. Now you'll notice this very soft edge, okay, and that's derived from the distance of the inner cone angle and the outer cone angle. Let's set this to 12, and let's take that inner cone angle up. If I begin to adjust that up, you'll notice that the light stays 100% intense, so bright, inside of that blue circle, and then it begins to fade out from that point there. If I were to make my inner cone angle and my outer cone angle the same, so let's set this to 12, you'll notice that we get this very hard edge around that light. This appears to be a spotlight in a theater or something like that. In this case, we don't want anything like that, so we're going to set this down to something like 6, and then hit escape to deselect that. And there you go, that's what that looks like. All right, so that is your point light and your spotlight. The other lights, like the skylight and the directional light, they do have other properties as well, but they're not quite as extensive. So, for example, we have the source type on the skylight, and this is going to capture the scene. The other option that we have is to use a specified cube map, which is going to use this value here in the cube map. Using the cube map is going to save you some memory, but normally we'll just use the captured scene. Now going out to our directional light, if I select it, you'll see that a lot of this appears to be the same. Intensity, light color, the one thing that you'll notice is used as atmosphere. If we turn that off, the light is not going to affect the atmosphere. So we get that true color on that. Now if I turn that back on, it's going to give us a little bit more of a realistic result, okay, on our skylight. Or, excuse me, not skylight, but skybox. All right, so that is pretty straightforward there. So now that we've talked about those properties, let's talk about that light mobility and how that's going to be important for us whenever we start building lights in our scene.